Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. This is the 6th entry in a series of videos in which I review and discuss each and every Warlord and their associated signature squad that we've seen released thus far. Today, I'll be focusing on the highs and lows of the first of our Eldar faction warlords. Keep in mind that although at this point we've seen the release of each and every expansion of the entire Warlord cycle of war packs, in this video I'm only going to be assessing the card synergy within the core set itself, although in later videos I'll be covering not only other core warlords, the non-signature cards of each core set faction, and eventually our various war packs as well. But moving right along, today we look to discuss the unique warlord unit Eldorath Starbane, with the Psyker and Alaitoc traits, an attack value of 1, 7 hit points, a starting hand size of 7, and 7 starting resources, and the ability Reaction. After this warlord commits to a planet, exhaust a target non-warlord unit at that planet. So, looking at the most superficial aspects, this warlord has a practically non-existent attack value, although he does happen to have a respectable pool of hit points and the same starting hand size and resource value that we've seen in each and every other core set warlord. Additionally, although when flipped to his bloody side he loses his ability like all of his peers, he nevertheless does maintain a fairly reasonable pool of hit points, although his attack value stays just as low as it ever is. But particularly for this Eldar warlord, you're not deploying this character for his attributes. Instead, you're very much going to be looking forward to leveraging that ability in your favor. Considering that under no circumstance can you ever target a warlord with this ability, with scarcely few exceptions, you can nevertheless exhaust practically any target enemy army unit that happens to be deployed at a planet that you commit him to. And, considering the event that rounds out Eldorath's signature squad, important to consider is that once a unit is exhausted, it no longer contributes any command icons to winning a command struggle. So if you're able to shift Eldorath's location after committing him that initial time, you can potentially make use of this ability to win not just one, but potentially multiple command struggles, in order to net yourself all the more cards and resources. However, considering that unless your opponent specifically deploys their warlord to the same planet as yours, that you'll be winning a command struggle regardless of how many command icons your opponent happens to have, the primary use of Eldorath's ability is going to be in preparing you to decimate your opponent's forces on the field of battle, specifically because an exhausted unit has to go through an entire round of combat before they're able to ready, attack you in return, or, depending on the unit, use any number of what could potentially be devastating abilities against you. The Eldar in particular, especially considering that they're able to ally with not just the Dark Eldar, but also the Tau, have myriad choices when it comes to picking units with the ranged keyword, and if you're not only able to take advantage of the ranged skirmish round to harass and destroy some of your opponent's units prior to conventional combat, but if you add on to that the ability to use Eldorath's ability to exhaust any opposing units with that ranged keyword, even if you don't happen to have the initiative token, you can potentially get in a large volume of attacks against your enemy before they have any opportunity whatsoever to respond in kind. Plus, considering those Tau allies in particular, not only do you have a large number of potentially potent and deadly ranged units to deploy, but you also have access to exceptionally hard-hitting attachments. And as this living card game's card pool continues to grow ever wider and ever expand, we'll not only see potent attachments like the +3 attack value Ion Rifle, or the +1 and X attack value Banshee Power Sword, but eventually our options are only going to be as limited as the creativity of this game's developers. Even though Eldorath himself isn't going to be of much use in a fight considering that fairly mediocre attack value, particularly considering that if your opponent is investing heavily in very expensive, albeit hard-hitting and powerful units, you can really punish him by ensuring that if there's maybe only one or a handful of enemy units at that planet, again with scarcely few exceptions, you can almost always guarantee that their situationally most dangerous unit has to miss out on at least one attack, if not also a potentially devastating ability. And, although it matches Eldorath for a very mundane attack value, if you're looking to exhaust even more of your opponent's units and frustrate him or her all the more, you can also choose to deploy the Silvered Blade Avengers, and though they themselves don't pose much of a threat, certainly you have access to a host of much higher attack value army units to ally them with. And if it just so happens that you happen to be investing heavily in relatively squishy units, something like a Sybarite marksman with an attached ion rifle or two, you're certainly welcome to take advantage of effects like the Fire Warrior Elite, to guarantee that at least in an attacking context, once you've exhausted your opponent's hard-hitting units, even if they're left with something small that could nevertheless pose a threat, you can take full advantage of that unit's ability to intervene between enemy attacks and soak up some damage to spare your squishiest of armies. And last but not least, seeing as how at this point in the card pool there's only one other unique Eldar option to do so, Eldorath could, in a pinch, be used to trigger the potent Eldar event Nullify, in order to cancel and utterly prevent the effects of any one potentially devastating enemy event. Of final note, I'll just mention that if at any point you find yourself playing Eldorath against a Space Marines, Tau, or Astra Militarum player, watch out for your opponent playing a Land Raider, because any non-vehicle units they happen to control at whatever planet they put that tank onto can no longer be targeted by card effects like Eldorath's, and although you maintain the ability to exhaust the Land Raider itself, they might nevertheless get the uncommon opportunity to leverage some sort of nasty, unpreventable effect against you. But with Eldorath sufficiently covered, let's move on to the first of his signature squad. We have 4 copies of the army unit Starbane's Council, with a cost of 3, the Psyker and Alaitoc traits, 1 command icon, 3 attack value, and 3 hit points. And importantly, this card reads, this unit gets +2 attack while attacking an exhausted unit. So, not only does this army unit have rather high stats for their resource investment, they potentially possess what could prove to be an enormous attack value. Although one of the pitfalls of this unit is that, depending on where you deploy it, you can relatively clearly telegraph where you're going to be committing your Warlord, you can nevertheless effectively force your opponent to give up command struggles, or potentially orchestrate a trap for them as well. Whatever planet you happen to put this unit at, your opponent has to consider at the back of their mind that Eldorath could easily commit to that planet at any point, and whether you have the initiative token or whether your opponent simply doesn't have very many units, if you can potentially strike one of their valuable armies for 5, you could potentially inflict what might amount to a devastating loss to your opponent. But beyond this unit's obvious synergy with your Warlord and conventional deployment, you can also use some particularly nasty effects to take tremendous advantage of that possible 5 attack value, namely the event Gift of Isha, specifically because Starbane's Council is likely to be killed at some point during combat. Particularly because with that passive effect, it paints itself out to be somewhat of a priority target for your enemy. But if you play that event, you can bring it back into play at the very end of the combat turn, after your opponent has run out of turns and there are guaranteed to be exhausted enemy units. In that case, Starbane's Council can not only hit like a truck, but even though in that situation it has to leave play at the end of the combat phase, at the end of that combat round it will nevertheless ready and potentially get to attack your opponent time and time again. Whether or not you're the one holding the initiative token, at the very least, hopefully you'll be able to squeeze in an additional attack for 3, but at the very least, it's yet another body in combat that your opponent will have to deal with, and potentially, if you're able to combine this with any number of other effects, your opponent might have to incur multiple attacks, or if you're very lucky and the battle is going in your favor, you might be able to deploy that enormous 5 attack value multiple times. As with any Eldar unit, the Corsair Trading Post support decreases the cost required to deploy this card, and if you're looking for other synergistic effects, because your opponent might be trying to leverage area effect against you if you do happen to be running a fair number of high attack value, low hit point units, it might be in your best interest to run 1 or more copies of the Shrouded Harlequin, just because even though Starbane's Council normally takes priority, if your opponent does decide to trigger an area effect volley and kill that unit, you get to pick and choose which of your enemy units to exhaust, and can then proceed to deal a potentially devastating blow in return with Starbane's Council. But in any case, certainly a very powerful signature card, and if you're looking to give your opponent even more of a headache, look no further than the next signature card in Eldorath's squad. It's the zero-cost attachment, Mobility, with 3 shield icons, the skill trait, and the text attached to an army unit, attached unit gains mobile, which, just to remind you, means that at the beginning of the combat phase, you can shift the attached unit to an adjacent planet. So, if you're looking to potentially lay and spring a trap on your opponent, you could commit Eldorath to a planet, exhaust an enemy unit, and then maybe take advantage of this mobility attachment in order to move an army unit like Starbane's Council to the same planet as your Warlord to leverage that enormous attack value against your enemy's potentially high value, now exhausted unit. Also worth noting, as with any other Eldar units that happen to possess that frustrating mobile keyword, is that that ability takes place at the very beginning of the combat phase, which allows you to dodge a combat window that might otherwise spell disaster for some of your fragile, hit-and-run style or otherwise harassing units. Or, in a different sense, this attachment could allow you to deploy a command icon heavy unit to one planet where a battle is unlikely to take place, so that you can attempt to win one more command struggle that round, and then, during the subsequent combat phase, activate that mobility keyword in order to shift that unit's location to where it can more actively contribute to a battle. Although this is, unfortunately, yet another one-copy card in a signature squad, it nevertheless has potentially potent offensive and defensive uses, in that if you're not looking to ambush an opponent, you can also flee, or if you have a unit that you very much want involved in combat but aren't sure where one is going to take place, you can hedge your bets by attaching this to a unit maybe deployed at Planet 3, so that if your opponent happens to send their Warlord to 2, 3, or 4, you're almost guaranteed to be able to opportunistically move the attached unit to that planet to participate in combat. One example that comes readily to mind, particularly given my fondness for the glass cannon type playstyle, is the Iyanden Wraithguard, one of the only units we've seen thus far with the potentially devastating Armorbane keyword. Even though it doesn't happen to have ranged, particularly if you have the initiative token, that might be an excellent target for mobility, just to guarantee that its enormous 4 base attack value is ready to punch through an enemy warlord or high-value army units. And again, considering that the Eldar are able to ally with the Tau, what are more copies of Ion Rifle affixed to the Iyanden Wraithguard make it all the more powerful, potentially able to inflict devastating blows, if not one-hit kills, to any number of expensive and normally resilient enemy army units. And seeing as how you're able to prevent your opponent in that case from deploying any shield cards to protect what quite possibly might be their most valuable assets, in the right circumstance, this attachment, combined with the right cards, could absolutely devastate your opponent. But the problem inherent to this is that's under the absolute ideal circumstance, and there's a hell of a lot that almost each and every other faction and warlord can do in order to negate the benefit of this one attachment. So, certainly this isn't the linchpin of any deck. It might not always be the most useful card to end up drawing, but at the very least, it certainly has enormous value in a pinch if expent for those 3, at times invaluable, shield icons. Last but not least, I'll just mention that one final bit of defensive utility for this attachment is, particularly if you've decided to stick a large number of attachments onto one of your units, whether or not it happens to have that ranged keyword, is that you can use this card to bide time until you're either holding the initiative token or there's some other kind of favorable game state that allows you to leverage your potentially vulnerable unit safely to its full effect against your opponent. But on to yet another one-copy card. We have the one-cost signature support, the Alaitoc Shrine, with the location and Alaitoc traits and reaction. After an Eldar unit moves to a planet, exhaust this support to ready that unit. So, unlike many other signature supports that we've seen, this one is rather situationally useful. Specifically because when an Eldar unit moves, it won't necessarily be exhausted. Probably the most obvious use for this support is that it has the benefit of allowing any unit committing to a planet alongside your Warlord from your headquarters to be ready during that oh-so-important first round of combat. And if it just so happens that you are accruing a large number of units in your HQ, this might end up being a fairly valuable support. The problem with it is, of course, that it can only target Eldar units. Any Dark Eldar or Tau allied army units are entirely ineligible. And of course, in order to trigger that reaction, this support itself has to exhaust. So at the present moment, it's limited to one use per turn. Considering that in the early game you're unlikely to have a lot of units following your Warlord, you might not see much use out of this, and considering that it has no shield icons, not only is this an inconsistent draw, but if you do invest that one resource, it might be a wildly inconsistent benefit to boot. It is important to keep in mind that triggering the mobile keyword does count as moving, just like committing alongside your Warlord during the command phase. But oh so important to keep in mind for this card are that any card effects that use the text return, retreat, place, or route, none of that actually counts as a move, and as such does not allow you an opportunity to trigger this ability. Plus, even if you do happen to have the chance to trigger this support, you won't actually always be able to benefit from that readying. So, probably the most obvious use is to allow a Starbane's Council following your Warlord, potentially round after round, to commit to a planet and then ready, so that it's free during that first round of combat to not just sit there doing nothing, but instead to decimate whichever unit your Warlord targets to exhaust. All in all, though, even though it's possible to get some reasonable use out of this card, out of all of the signature cards we've seen thus far, and particularly out of Eldorath's squad, this one really strikes me as only situationally appealing. But regardless of your opinion of the Alaitoc Shrine, we have one more signature card to round out Starbane's squad. It is 2 copies of the one-cost event, Foresight, with 1 shield icon, the power trait, and reaction. After your Warlord commits to a planet, commit it to a different planet. So, not only is this an exceptionally affordable event, but considering that both players' Warlords are committed to their respective planets simultaneously, this allows you the unique opportunity to not only dodge traps, but also to trigger Eldorath's ability multiple times. It's possible that you can use that to not only block powerful enemy actions that require their units to exhaust, but additionally, you can set up multiple units to be utterly devastated by the hard-hitting strikes of Starbane's Council. Furthermore, if you happen to have a large contingent of units following your Warlord, which allows your opponent to either predict or otherwise telegraph where you're probably going to be deploying Starbane, you can try to deceive them by committing your Warlord, and possibly the majority of your forces, to an important planet, possibly challenging your opponent's Warlord in combat, and then, if the situation calls for it, once you have all of that information, you can play Foresight and move Eldorath to a different planet, to not only potentially win an additional command struggle, but to exhaust another enemy unit, and potentially leverage not just one, but 2 command struggles and or battles in your favor. You might be able to opportunistically snipe a unit like a Rogue Trader or Void Pirate in the early game, Or if it just so happens that you're able to exploit some unfortunate deployment of an opponent's more expensive unit, maybe if you're able to leverage the mobile keyword in your favor in conjunction with redeploying your Warlord, or you can use an effect like the Wild Rider Squadron's combat action to shift them to a planet where it benefits you most, this could potentially allow you a fantastic opportunity to really punish your opponent. But in any case, this event allows you the fantastic opportunity to not only make your Warlord's ultimate place of commitment difficult, if not impossible to predict, but it prevents him from being pinned down in all but the most dire of straits. Overall, considering the enormous offensive and defensive potential inherent to this event, in that it can not only shift one or two command struggles and or battles during the same turn in your favor, but it has the potential to make an enormous difference on the outcome of a game. And considering that you not only have 2 copies of this card in your deck, but that further, if you're really looking to leverage this in your favor, you can deploy your Dark Eldar army unit ally, the Colosseum Fighters, in order to return this event to your hand. It's possible that you could make a single game of Conquest immensely frustrating for your opponent by preventing them under all but the most dire of circumstances from having any ability whatsoever to reliably predict where you're going to ultimately commit your Warlord. So, taken all together, despite Eldorath's somewhat lackluster stats, I think his signature squad is very well suited to leverage that exhaustion effect in your favor, and combined with the ranged and mobile abilities inherent to not only the Eldar, but also their allied factions, this Warlord and his signature squad can certainly provide an enormous pain for any opponent. But with that said, I'll go ahead and bring this video to a close. So as always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. If you'd like to share your own thoughts, uses, or opinions for Eldorath Starbane or any of the cards constituting his signature squad, be sure to leave a comment below. If you've got gameplay experiences that you'd like to share, I would love to read about those as well. And in any case, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.